Live hacking events, mobile hacking, and managing a bug bounty program are three things that I'm very much interested in. And I'm lucky because my today's guest has been attending live hacking events for years, is a great mobile hacker, and now he manages a bug bounty program. Enjoy my interview with Joel Margolis. Hello, Joel. Thank you so much for joining me in today's podcast. For those of you who don't know you, first of all, you should know Joel because you should be listening to the Critical Thinking Bug Bounty podcast. But if some people, for some reason, don't do it, can you please introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure, yeah. So I'm Joel Margolis, aka Technogeek. I'm the co-host of the Critical Thinking Bug Bounty podcast with Justin, aka Rhinerator. So yeah, you can go find us at criticalthinkingpodcast.io or anywhere where you listen to your podcasts.
Yeah, and right now, are you a full-time bug bounty hunter? Are you a pen tester? What are you doing right now?
Sure, yeah. So I bug bounty as sort of a part-time thing, and then full-time during the day, I work at Match Group, where I manage a team over there, and I also manage the bug bounty programs.
Yeah. How did you start with cybersecurity, and how did you get to this point?
I think I kind of stumbled into cybersecurity, to be honest. When I was in high school, which is, I was probably like 16 or so, for those of you outside of the States. I was really into programming and computers and video games and all that kind of stuff. I sort of taught myself how to program, and I was writing this software project that used this private API for an app. I won't say which one, but it's a well-known social media app. And I had written, this tool. It was mostly just for like personal use and for friends and stuff. But the tool stopped working one day. And so I opened up the GitHub page for this API and I started looking into it. And there was this issue that was ongoing for a while of people who were saying, oh, the newest version breaks this. Like, we're having all sorts of problems. If you want to help out, join this Skype group. This was back in the days where Skype was the sort of the thing. So I joined this Skype group, and that's sort of where I got introduced to a bunch of people who were good at reverse engineering mobile apps. And this was sort of my like accidental introduction into security, because I didn't really know it at the time, but I was learning how to, figure out how APIs work and read through code and decompile mobile apps and all these like really nice security fundamentals from this group. And all I was trying to do was just figure out how this API worked so I could get my tool to work again, because I didn't really care. I was just very targeted on this goal. So yeah, I started learning how to take apart mobile apps and figure out how they work and proxy them, and look at the API requests and turn them into code, and then use that code to call the APIs and all that stuff. So that was kind of how I really got introduced into security. And I did that for a little while. And then when I went to college or university, I ended up, again, sort of accidentally majoring in computing security instead of computer science. I had originally been planning on going for computer science, and I didn't find out until my orientation day that I was actually a computing security major.
It's orientation day for because we don't have it in Poland.
Yeah. So this was just like the first day of college. Like the first day you show up on campus, like your parents are dropping you off with all your stuff, and you're like finding your dorm room or whatever. And yeah, I got like my badge with my name, and it said my major on it. It said computing security. I was like, huh, that's weird. I didn't remember that. And yeah,
so you applied for computer science, but I don't know.
I thought I did, but maybe I didn't. I honestly don't remember. I do remember when I was touring the college that I had seen they were doing one of the clubs at the college. I went to Rochester Institute of Technology, and one of the clubs there was like a cybersecurity club, and they were presenting and they were talking about all these like how to hack and these different hacking topics, and they were giving talks, and there was all these students sort of just like on their free time who were attending, and I was like, oh, that's really cool, that's really interesting. And I remember I'd sort of walked away that day thinking, oh wow, I wouldn't mind going to this college. So yeah, I feel like fate sort of made it all happen, and so I stumbled into security. That was my college. I started working doing bug bounty shortly in college. So after my first year, I was doing an internship, and the intern who sat across from me in the office was this guy who goes by the username Cool Boss, or his name's Pranav, and he was a pretty big Facebook bug bounty hunter at the time. He had found a bunch of bugs on Facebook. He had been doing bug bounty, and he knew that I was into mobile security. And he said, "Hey, there's this CTF coming up. It's a mobile CTF. Maybe you should check it out." And I was really into CTFs. CTFs were just sort of a fun way for me to, learn different security fundamentals and test different tools and see these real world scenarios. And I really enjoyed them. And so I was like, "Oh, sure. Then, that sounds like a fun thing to do on the weekend. I got, nothing better to do." And so I did the CTF. They wanted you to do these write-ups. I did these write-ups, whatever, I submitted. And then I get an email like a couple weeks later. They're like, "Hey, you're one of the finalists for the HackerOne H1 702 CTF. Like, you get a free ticket to Vegas and an invite to our live hacking event." And I had no idea what like any of this was. I didn't really understand what like bug bounty was, or I wasn't really interested in it at the time. Even though he had told me, like I found these bugs and they paid me a lot of money for it, it didn't really click. And so I went to Vegas. That was my first DEF CON, and I kind of just saw it as like, "Oh, cool, I'm getting to go to DEF CON. Like, it's the security conference that everybody goes to and whatever." And then I like showed up at this live hacking event. I didn't know anybody. Like, all these hackers are like talking to me and stuff who I now know, like, years later. It was just a really sort of, again, I feel like I just sort of fell into it by accident. So that's kind of how I got into bug bounty. That's how I got into security. I've been doing it ever since. That was in, again, 2017. And, I've always sort of been focused on mobile for my background in mobile reversing. And that's kind of how I got into it.
Yeah, it is a crazy story. Like for me, for many of people watching us, live hacking events are like the goal, something we really want to take part of. And you seem to just be there, and you probably didn't care much about it since you said you didn't really know what it was about.
Yeah. And at the time, they did this, for a couple of years in the early times of the live hacking events, where they wanted to try and find really talented hackers who didn't really know what hacking was or didn't know what bug bounty was, because this was still when bug bounty was also kind of new. And so one of the other
finalists, year was it, more or less?
This was 2017.
Okay,
so this was like I think the second live hacking event that HackerOne had ever done. I think the first one had been the year before, also in Vegas. It was much, much smaller. It wasn't at a big event. It was just like a suite or something that they'd rented out, and a couple people had come. So this one, like Andre, 0xACB, he was also one of the CTF finalists who showed up, and now he's at all the live hacking events as well. So, this was a really good way to source new hackers, people who didn't really know what hacking was, but they had like CTF chops. And I've always seen people who are really good at capture the flag events to have really good bug bounty skill sets, because they have so much hands-on experience exploiting bugs, figuring out how stuff works, that natural curiosity to just sort of like find the flag or exploit the bug. That's always been like a pretty good indicator. And so I think HackerOne tried to capitalize on that, and it seemed to work at least a couple times.
Yeah, it did. And also Shabs, when he was here a few months ago, he said that it is a really good indicator for him when recruiting people to his company, that people who play CTFs are really, really good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And since then, you're hacking. Have you been hacking for the full time since then, for a little period, or what happened after the live hacking?
Yeah. So I started, sort of like pseudo full-time hacking, I guess. I was doing a lot of bug bounty 2017, 2018. Come 2019. So actually at that live hacking event, one of the targets was Uber. And they had these specific challenges, try and bypass this thing or whatever. So I was like, "Oh, that looks fun." And I was really out of the loop on the event. So I focused on that. I bypassed it. I got to do a show and tell. And so the team was like, "Oh, this kid is pretty, he seems to know what he's doing." Fast forward like a year or two, and I'm applying for internships in college. I'm looking for my next summer internship. And one of my friends who had just graduated, he's working at Uber. And I was like, "Hey, would you mind, giving me a referral so I can, apply for this internship?" And immediately the team accepts me. And I find out later they knew who I was from that live hacking event. And so they were like, "Oh yeah, for sure. We want this guy as our intern." And, I ended up dropping out of college after my internship. I worked at Uber full time for, I think about 2 or 2.5 years. And then eventually in December of 2020, I moved over to Tinder originally. I was working at Tinder doing security, and then the Tinder security team moved up into Match Group, and now we manage security for all the Match Group brands as well as Tinder.
Yeah. What is in the Match Group apart from Tinder?
There are a lot of brands inside of Match Group. Probably the big ones that people would probably know are Tinder, Hinge, Plenty of Fish, OkCupid, Match.com. Medic is one of our international brands in Europe. In Asia, we have Hyperconnect and Pairs. So yeah, we have a lot of brands sort of all over the place.
Okay, so but are all these around dating, like Tinder? Because this and Hinge.
Yeah, exactly. So Match Group, their whole portfolio is basically online, matching and dating and pairing people together. So yeah.
Yeah, cool. And these days, in regards to you being a bug bounty hunter, not the program manager, does your schedule revolve solely around live hacking events, or do you just hack every single week? How does it look like?
Yeah, so it varies a lot for sure. Obviously my job is sort of my top priority, and then everything else fits in wherever I can. So I do try to have like a balance between being able to hack and having time to work. So most of the time, if I'm at a live hacking event, I'm taking time off, basically. So I try not to be traveling too much. But some of it's unavoidable. And for the live hacking events, usually there's a pretty big incentive, monetarily to, perform and stuff. So I try and, maximize my amount of time there. Sometimes I'll even take time off ahead of the events, in order to, prep for those and stuff. But yeah, it can definitely be a bit tricky to sort of balance the two.
Yeah. In terms of preparation for the live hacking event, I will attend my first live hacking event in Vegas this year. I definitely do not approach it like you did, like not knowing what happens. For me, it's a big thing. And I like to, take the best out of the opportunity I have. So what are your tips for me to prepare for this, and how should I plan everything and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So what I would recommend, I don't know, I have a guess of probably which one, if you know by now. So my guess is they'll probably do the scope call when they open up for submissions, or maybe a little bit before. And so you can probably guess what the scope will be. So familiarize yourself with that target just a little bit up front, depending on how hard you want to go. I think people set different goals and expectations for themselves. Some people want to be top 5. Some people just want to find one bug. So it really sort of depends on what you want to get out of it. If your goal is to be top 5, then you're definitely going to want to do a lot more prep ahead of time. If your goal is to find one bug, then, don't go crazy and find some, product that you can focus in on. I think for top 5, it does require in these days to have sort of a wide scope of things as well as the severity level. So you need to be finding really critical things and a bunch of things as well. I think just planning out your time and setting aside time for hacking. Like if you're going to be going to a live hacking event, then set at least a week of dedicated every day, 8 to 10 to 12 hours a day, hacking, just nonstop, hands on keyboard, head down, focusing on the scope for the event, finding everything that you can, taking lots of notes. It's an event, right? So it's definitely sort of like a little bubble that you got to put yourself into and just really get in the zone. And you want to sort of perform the best that you can. So it's important to take it seriously, I think. If you don't take it seriously, then you'll sort of you get out what you put in. I see a lot. So if you don't put in a lot of effort and you don't put in a lot of time and you don't take it super seriously, then you probably won't see as good results. But definitely, if you put in the time, you put in the effort, and you focus in on parts of the target, it'll be worth it. The other thing I'd say is don't put all your eggs in one basket. I've definitely done this before, where I've spent a ton of time on one thing. I've said, okay, I'm going to spend all my time focusing on this one thing. We're going to find some bugs. Nothing. And so, if it is sort of a gamble, and you do have sort of this you don't want to put, there's a sunk cost, right? So you don't want to put too much time in one thing, and sort of, knowing when to cut your losses and know to say, okay, think it's time to move on to the next target or focus on the next thing or look at some of my notes again. And maybe I'll put this on the back burner for now, and then I'll come back to it later. I think that's really important as well.
So in the sort of practical sense, there are sort of, as far as I know now, there are kind of three phases. The first is when you know the customer, but you don't officially know the scope, but you can hack already on the customer, even if you're not sure if the thing you're hacking on will be in scope. Then for like 3 weeks before the event, there's the scope call that you mentioned, and then we know the scope, and then officially the event starts. And then the last phase is the in-person stage. Is this correct?
Yeah, generally speaking. So the way that it typically works, and I'm not 100% sure, I'm not 100% sure about the bug crowd events, how they work now, because I haven't been to one in a while, but at least generally speaking for HackerOne events, the way that it works is you get an invite, and at that point, they'll tell you, this is the target, don't tell anyone, it's in this location. These are the on-site dates. These are the full event dates. And the full event dates are probably going to be maybe a week or two before the in-person dates. And the in-person dates are going to be somewhere between 3 and 5 or 6 days on site. Time for travel, time for the event, maybe a day, maybe 2 for the event, and then a day after, and then travel home. When you know the customer, like you said, you can, do some recon. You can look at their program. You can probably infer, okay, here's what they own. Maybe if they're a really large program, which a lot of the time they are, everything they own is already in scope. So okay, either the event's going to be some new acquisition that they haven't ever tested before, or it's going to be some specific part of their scope, or maybe some new feature that they haven't, that they've just released, or they want tested, or they're going to release, or whatever. And then they do a scope call. During the scope call, they're going to say, this is the specific scope for the event. So what we want you to focus on. Maybe it's everything. A lot of the time it's not. Usually it's like one specific thing or a couple specific products. They'll reveal bounty bonuses, which are usually the big thing. So either a larger table as a whole, or specific, like, most critical finding on this, first critical finding on this, that kind of stuff. The, big cash bonuses that are, good. Everybody likes that. And then they'll sort of like create a Slack. They'll invite everybody. They'll invite the customer. Like everybody gets in. Like you can start asking questions. You can start, maybe they'll give you test accounts, whatever. And it's sort of go time. And then there's basically what's called a duplicate window, which it used to be that when a live hacking event kicked off, it was just a race. And Franz actually created this tool called Bounty Plus, which was like an automation tool where you would pre-write all your reports, and then you would like run this tool at the start of the event, and it would submit all your reports like it would format them and whatever, and would submit them to HackerOne as fast as possible, so that you could beat the dupe window, because there was no dupe window. It was just like whoever submitted it first got it. And then you would dupe on them. So there came a point where we had a discussion. They were like, hey, how do you think we're running events? And I remember I was in on this conversation. I was like, I think it's kind of crazy that like it feels so competitive. We should just have a window where there's a like duplicate. And I think Shopify did an event where they were the first one to trial this. And it was great because like it just removed all of that like anxiety around like timing and being the first to click the button and whatever. It was just like, here's 2 weeks. Anybody who finds the same issue is going to get duped on each other. You're all going to split the bounty evenly among all the reports, and that window closes, a few days before the event starts, so that people don't have to worry about during travel and all that kind of stuff. I think the only exception for that is like criticals. And even that, like maybe if the same critical came in twice, maybe it would get split. I'm not 100% sure. I actually don't know. I don't know if I've been on in that experience. So I'm sure somebody does know. But yeah, usually crits, they like try and fix it as soon as possible. If it comes in during the dupe window, they don't leave it open until the events start. But yeah, and then obviously everybody travels on site. There's maybe they'll announce a new scope on the day of the event or whatever. Like it's kind of up to the customer. It really depends a lot of the time. Sometimes they'll do that depending on how people are feeling and how many dupes they're seeing and all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then you'll have 1 or 2 on-site dedicated hacking days. You're in person. You're with a bunch of hackers in a physical space. You're with the customer in a physical space. You can talk with them. You can talk with the triagers. You can talk with the people who work at HackerOne. It's a very social sort of thing. And then you usually they do some sort of thing like the day after the event, like a social like group event. They'll, whatever city we're in, where they might do a tour or something, and then the next day, like everybody flies home.
Yeah, I can't wait for it. I do have a lot of anxiety over the performance, but I just can't wait for the last part of it and meeting everyone.
Don't worry about it, man. It's part of it is the connections, but part of it is also just like the experience of being there, and like you got the invite that already like you're through the door, right? So don't worry about it too much, and just do your thing, be your best, and what got you there will get you through it.
Yeah. What about some maybe practical things that you've done wrong over some of the events you've attended, like not around hacking strictly, but mainly about maybe traveling, planning, taking the gear with you?
Yeah, sure, for sure. So make sure you've got power adapters for sure. What I do is, I see you use Notion. I love Notion. I have a Notion template, and I have a whole separate like timeline board for trips. And I have it all set up so that every time I have a new trip coming up, I create an entry for it, and I say these are the start and end dates, and it goes in date order, and it's templated off of a list that I've curated over the last 5 or so, 6, 7 years of traveling a lot for live hacking events, and just traveling a lot in general. And every time I pack, I go through this list, I check stuff off, I remove anything that I don't need, and then I know, okay, I've checked everything on the list. I have everything I need. So I have one for, my clothing. I have one for my electronic stuff. So like chargers, laptops, power converters, test devices, extra monitor, headphones, like all of it, just to make sure that I've got it charged and that I've got it in the bag and then I'm good to go. And that removes a lot of travel anxiety for me. Just like having a list that I know that if I've checked everything off, then it's in my bag and I for sure have it, and I don't have to worry about thinking about, oh shit, did I, leave that in my room, or did I forget to pack that or whatever. So that's one big thing. Another thing is managing your sleep and time zones. So depending on where you are, it can be pretty rough. I've done some really big time zone jumps before. I think probably the biggest one I've done was going from California to Japan. That's a 16-hour time difference. Wow. So you're just like all over the place. Don't know what time it is. You're trying to fall asleep in the middle of the day and all that kind of stuff. So melatonin is always really good. Not as necessarily a sleep aid, but just to help tell your body, hey, it's time to go to sleep. So like an hour or two before it's time to go to bed, take some melatonin. And that seems to help me pretty well. I also try and sleep on flights whenever I can, and just like try and time it. So if I'm landing in the day, try to time it so that I get a little bit of sleep on the flight, so that when I quote unquote wake up, it's light out, and that helps me reset a little bit. But having a packing list and trying to manage your sleep and time zones are probably the two biggest things I would say, because you're gonna feel a lot better, and you're gonna be like more present in your headspace as well. So yeah, these are good ones. I will remember about these. Also, you mentioned, I think in one of the podcasts, an app for changing the time zone. Oh yeah, I totally forgot. I actually haven't. Oh man, I should have. I've gone on some trips recently and I did not use it, but I should. It's called Time Shifter. Yeah, so there's this app called Time Shifter. I got this thing and I was so hyped about it, and then I kind of realized that it's a little bit common sense. So like once you've used it a couple times, you kind of know like what not to do. I think the biggest things where it's kind of nice are when it tells you when you should and shouldn't drink caffeine. But basically, this app Time Shifter, you say, hey, I'm flying from this city to this city on this date for these dates. And it'll say, okay, like 2 days ahead of time, go to bed like 2 hours later. And then at one day, go to bed 3 hours later. And then like the day of, like, don't drink any coffee, within these hours, and try not to get any light exposure during these hours and that kind of stuff. And that is really helpful also for managing jet lag. If you have United 1K or above, I think you get it for free. Otherwise it's not very expensive for the subscription, but, it's pretty. I've definitely awesome. Used it.
I've never been more than 4 hours from my time zone. So I guess for you, being at like almost every single life hacking event since 2017, you don't need that, but I definitely do.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot, and it's a great app. They give you a couple free uses in the beginning, I think too. So if you're unsure about it, you can just try it out and see how it works for you.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Yeah. Let's imagine we are at the live hacking event already. Let's come back to hacking a little bit. So what back classes are you focusing on? Are you still mostly mobile hacker?
Yeah, so I've recently, probably within the last year or two, I've tried to step away from mobile hacking a little bit, just because it is my bread and butter, but it didn't feel like it was really challenging me so much, and it just felt very repetitive, and I wanted to sort of learn something new and flex areas where I didn't feel as confident. So I've been trying to get more into web hacking, more API hacking is sort of all universal, I feel like, in terms of just looking at how the endpoints work and testing parameters and all that kind of stuff. But definitely focusing more on higher severity bugs. For me, usually the bar for what I choose to report is pretty high. I don't I'm not the kind of person who will report a low or a medium unless I have to. If I find something and if I find something that I don't feel is really that severe, 99% of the time I'm writing it down as a gadget, and I'm okay, let me see if I can use that later or come back to that. I'm not just going to report it and say, here's email to user ID or something. I'm going to keep that and see if I can use that for some, PII leak or a mass IDOR or something.
Yeah, now I remember we worked on a bug a few months ago, which was in this kind of, there is a bug, but none of us was particularly keen on reporting this. I guess it's one of these things.
Yep, exactly.
What typical mobile bugs can have high or critical severity?
So a lot of the really high ones I've seen, there's sort of levels to it, right? So with mobile, there's a native layer, and that can usually be really, really critical stuff where you're more on the lines of code execution or even potentially remote code execution. And that usually has to be chained together. So I think most of the cases I've seen of that are where you have some sort of arbitrary file read or write, where you can create a file on the system and then that file gets loaded and executed as code. And then that's ultimate impact. But it's pretty uncommon from what I've seen. It does happen from time to time, usually actually in the more complex apps because they're doing such funky things. That
are you talking now, sorry to interrupt, but are you talking now something about binary exploitation level, or is it still some functionality, file write, file read, and then execute?
Yeah, so it kind of bridges the gap. You do have once it starts getting loaded as code or loaded as a library or something, and then you have binary sort of code execution, or but leading up to that, it's probably some sort of Android misconfiguration. So, there are a variety of Android specific and mobile specific. I'll say mostly Android is what I work on, but a lot of this stuff applies in different ways to iOS as well. So on Android, you can often find that there'll be a misconfigured file provider or some sort of access to the file system where they're storing a temporary file and they might be reading or writing from it, but they put it in an insecure place, and so another app can read from that or write to that and access those files and access that information. Those types of vulnerabilities are very Android specific. Then there's the whole you can just never look at the app. You could just proxy it. You could just unpin it, and you can just look at all the API requests. You can look at the backend calls, and you could never even take a peek at any Java code or anything that's going on inside the app other than here's the HTTP calls that are being made. And that's also totally acceptable. I think a lot of people are just doing that sort of mobile hacking. So if you dive into the really mobile specific hacking, that's probably where you're going to do less in the mobile scene, is not looking at the API endpoints, but looking at what are the activities exposed? What JavaScript interfaces exist? Is there a web view in here? Are there things that are being exported that shouldn't be? Are there permissions or a lack of permissions? That kind of stuff. Yeah, for Android, a lot of it, especially when building a POC. So I mentioned JavaScript interfaces and web views. That's probably one of the best scenarios that you can put together is if you have some way to open a web view in the app to an arbitrary URL, then you can usually trigger that from one click in the same way that you would from a web. So you're on your browser and you click a button and it opens a link through a schema and it automatically opens that app. and then it's going to open a web view inside the app to an arbitrary URL. And then if that web view has JavaScript interfaces that allow it to interact back and forth with the Java code, then, there's a variety of different things. I mean, I've seen really crazy implementations within JavaScript interfaces of ways to interact with the app. Just like action handlers or whatever, right? Where you just say like, do this thing. And there's like a list of a ton of different possibilities of things that probably would never actually be used, but they exist. And so an attacker can call those and do a lot of, really privileged tasks or, do things that they probably shouldn't be able to do straight from the JavaScript through this arbitrary URL.
If it's a scenario where, let's say you have Android activity, I think it's called, where you need to have another app installed on the victim's phone, what's usually the risk of it? Considering, let's say the impact of the bug is you can take over an account. How do companies look at the attack scenario where the attacker has to have an app installed on the victim's phone?
Yeah, so I think even from a CVSS level, your attack vector automatically is basically local or physical, like probably physical, right? Because local would imply local network. So it's a really, really difficult attack scenario to justify. I think it's one of those things that has to be sort of looked at a little bit differently than most types of bugs, because if you ignore the context of this is, a mobile app on a mobile phone, there's lots of different ways that mobile phones can be compromised and stuff, then you could say, this is almost impossible to exploit. But I think it's getting more and more common that, people's devices are able to be exploited. There's people are downloading apps from the Play Store that have malware on them. People are, side-loading apps for other functionality, and they don't know where that's coming from, and they're just sort of blindly installing it. So these things do happen. I would love to see some sort of like data, maybe from like Google, that talks a little bit about what the actual risk is of this, and like how many people are doing this, and what the risk like profile sort of looks like, because I think for programs it's really difficult to determine how to handle those things. And every program is going to be a little bit different in terms of like what their risk scenario looks like and what the accepted risk is for them. And so they might just say, okay, if you have to install another app on the phone to exploit this, like we're willing to accept that risk, or, maybe they'll take it, a little more seriously, but it can be really difficult to protect against that kind of stuff. So I think probably some sort of guidance from like Google, or, because they would probably have the most information, but some sort of guidance on like, how realistic these sort of exploits are and how often they're happening would help shape how it should affect severity. Because if you sort of say, okay, like this is the mitigation level, now let's just look at the exploit. It's an RCE or whatever, but you have to have an app on the phone. All right, well, should it be a medium or should it be a high, right? Like, but I think still calling it a critical can be really challenging because of that mitigating factor, and that like requirement of that level of user interaction or that level of user exploitation in order to fully exploit it.
Yeah, and also would probably be useful to have a CVSS for mobile apps, maybe created by somebody with a lot of data, because you mentioned that the physical, but if you set attack scenario to physical, then you're sort of on par with somebody actually plugging the USB into their device and potentially, jailbreaking or rooting the device physically. I think it's still more likely that, we have hundreds of apps installed. It's way more likely that one of them wants to do something malicious rather than, somebody having access to our phone physically.
Right. Like, I think nowadays, like, honestly, the most likely scenario is that some app developer has their credentials in a Telegram list, and somebody logs in and compromises that app, and then they upload a malicious version of the app that gets distributed. It goes through Play Store Protect, it sneaks through or whatever, and they infect a bunch of people who've already installed this app, and then the next time they open it, it does something malicious. And that's a really tricky risk scenario, because that could be happening right now for all we know. A lot of programs would say, okay, this doesn't matter. But then if it was happening to them, like, of course they take it seriously. So it's really just, how likely is it? And figuring out how to weigh that with like reality versus like theory, it can be really challenging, I think.
Yeah, I would definitely put this, if I would write a report about it, I would list different scenarios. I would definitely not think about a developer being compromised. It is definitely likely, and it's definitely something I would put now in the report. If I were a mobile hacker, but I'm not really into these things yet. For us, a little bit more beginner, how can we utilize mobile apps maybe to like extract HTTP endpoints, get some information about the target?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple really good tools. JADX is probably the main tool that I would recommend to most people. JADX has a JADX GUI. It's literally just like a jar file. You run it, it opens up an app. It says, hey, drag and drop your APK in. You drag it in. It lets you explore the decompiled Java code. Very, very straightforward. It has searching, has jump to definition. It has a lot of, sort of IDE almost, like the developer sort of tools where you can jump to things, and I think you can even create Frida scripts from it automatically and stuff. There's all sorts of really good features in there. I use that as my main decompiler. I use the CLI version, but it's the same thing. That's a really great tool, I think, for a lot of people. If you're just wanting to like look at how the APK works and look at the code and figure out how that works at the low level, JADX is great. Then for proxying and stuff, so I have a Frida script that I published on the Frida code share. I'll send a link to you. I don't know if you have a way to share links and stuff.
I'll link in the description.
But this is generally what this is my go-to. I try to update it if I ever make updates to it on my local version. But generally, this is what I use like 99% of the time for unpinning SSL on apps. This catches a lot of the really big SSL pinning methods, OKHTTP, the built-in Android ones, the trust managers, like all sorts of things. And then for cases where it doesn't, that's when you have to get a little more bespoke, and often that's when you'll have to dig into the code as well to try and figure out how they're doing the pinning. Maybe they've done it with a generic library, but they've obfuscated the class names, so it's not getting hooked. It can vary a lot. We're actually doing a masterclass with the critical thinkers on the Critical Thinking Bug Bounty Discord next week, specifically around this topic of SSL pinning and how to get around those really tricky edge cases. Because there was a really great example that I was looking at just a couple weeks ago where somebody was like, hey, I tried your script, didn't work, and they nerd sniped me, and I spent a bunch of time, and I was like, this is really interesting. So it's definitely one of those things that can be kind of tricky, but I think like most of the time this script works really well, and unless they've done something special to change up how they're doing cert pinning, this works out of the box a lot of the time. And then you can just proxy it, install your burp cert on the device. There's a ton of tutorials out there on how to install the certificate on the device, and you just install it, trust it, and then you just proxy through. For proxying, I actually have there's a blog post that I made many years ago for HackerOne, I believe, which was like talking about how to get into like the intros to mobile hacking. A lot of it was just like general knowledge and stuff, but probably the most useful things were some of the tips that I put at the end. And one of those things is that you can proxy over USB with ADB. So if you don't know, ADB is the Android debug bridge, and it's generally how you can, open a shell on your device, or you can push and pull files from it, or you can run commands on the device, and all these types of stuff. And usually it's by plugging in with USB. You can do it wirelessly, actually, but obviously for this case, I would recommend just you want to take advantage of the fact that it's over USB. So a lot of the times, say you're hacking in a hotel, there's client isolation. So you can't proxy from your device to your laptop, even if you're on the same subnet, even if you have the IP, you can't talk between clients. Well, with ADB proxy, you can. What you do is you ADB reverse, and you give it, TCP port 8080, TCP port 8080, and that makes a tunnel on the device from port 8080 on the device to port 8080 on your host. And it all goes over the USB, over the cable. And then you can just, proxy to localhost port 8080 on your device, and all that traffic gets funneled through ADB to your burp suite. And on your burp suite, you just keep listening on localhost 8080. You don't have to listen on any new interfaces or anything like that. And it just works out of the box. So yeah, that's one of my real favorite tips is using ADB to proxy. That's something that I do all the time. It works the same way with emulators too, even though there's no physical cable. It's just like you can proxy from your emulator to your host with ADB. You don't have to worry about the different virtual networks and stuff that it creates for the emulator. It's just, 127. What else? Root AVD is this project. It's a great tool. I believe it lives on GitLab now. I'll send you a link to it as well.
Yeah, send me a link and I'll link it later.
Yeah, but it's a tool for rooting the emulators that you would create with Android Studio. So especially nowadays with the ARM64 chips in the new Macs, and there's even laptops now with ARM64 chips. It's definitely way easier to run emulators that are running native ARM64 on the host than it is to try and emulate that. Or if you're running on like an x86 host, then your emulator also is going to run x86 for the most performant version. And a lot of apps don't have libraries for x86, or they're not cross-compiled for all architectures, so they might not even be downloadable. They might not work at all on the emulator. So it's just a whole thing. If you're running native ARM64, it's really great. And so I just use the default out-of-the-box Android Studio emulator. And you can use this tool to root those images, because a lot of times it'll say, this is a production build, so you can't run ADB root, and you don't know what to do from there. Well, this is what you do from there. You use this and it roots it like it was a physical device. It roots the system image. It like installs Magisk. It installs the SU APK, and then you can run, basically like Super SU or whatever, right? And you just run like SU and you approve it, just like as if you rooted a physical Android device. And then you can still use the Play Store. You can still use all that kind of stuff. And it's a great tool. Yeah, I use it all the time.
Do you have a physical device as well, or you don't think it's necessary?
Yeah, I do. So for certain things, Bluetooth, and anything you're testing with Bluetooth, that's definitely a big blocker for emulators, because you can't emulate Bluetooth. And I think even on Linux, you can't do Bluetooth pass-through to the emulator. I know you can on Mac and PC, at least, not that I've been able to figure out. So anything that tests with Bluetooth, usually it won't even let you download it from the Play Store. And so that's where physical devices are really great. Just at least having it to download the APK or to test with, there are definitely just instances where having a physical device is better. Any type of emulator detection, bypassing it can sometimes just really be a pain. And so just using a physical device for that as well can be really nice. So yeah, I have a physical Android device. I have a physical iOS device. The iOS device is still running like iOS 14 or something because it's jailbroken, and I don't want to upgrade it. And that's great, but I will have to eventually upgrade it, I think.
Yeah, I remember the pain of like being so cautious to not update the version of iOS when we did some.
The problem is now that there are apps that require like iOS 15 or above. And I can't install them, and I can't test them because it's too old. But if I upgrade, then I lose my jailbreak. So I'm in a little bit of a pickle. But that's also part of one of the reasons why I really like Android testing is you don't have these sort of hurdles for like you don't have to have a jailbroken device or some sort of like other hacky method of like running the app or like using Corellium or whatever. Like you just root your Android. And you just install it.
In what cases do you actually test iOS instead of the Android?
Usually if there's only an iOS app, or if I'm doing a pen test that requires iOS testing, I'll do it if it's necessary. But also I'll usually say like I prefer doing the Android side, but I can also do the iOS.
Yeah. When we used to do some pen testing, it was almost always just the same findings in Android and iOS. Just iOS would take so much longer to test, and sometimes the 5 days of a mobile pen test, 4 days was preparing, bypassing the jailbreak detection, bypassing the SSL pinning. It's probably the only piece of like binary hacking I've ever done in my life to do some bypass of SSL. And also you mentioned there will be a masterclass in the Critical Thinking's Discord. For people that are listening to this, it's already in the past, yes. But if you're a Critical Thinking member, it is definitely available on the exclusive contents channel, it's called.
Correct.
So you can go and take a look, and it is definitely for me one of the things that sort of still keeps me from doing any mobile hacking is all the things you had to do to even start testing, because it's very time consuming.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Like you said, we record all of the masterclasses and we post them in that channel. So I actually did a mobile like setup and intro, like setting up Frida and getting all of that working. I think I even covered a couple of the tools that I just talked about in that. And so that also should be recorded and in there if you're interested. You can just go to ctbb.show/Discord and that'll take you right to the Discord.
Yeah, and the other sort of side of this is in Bug Bounty, we all have to somehow differentiate from the others, and often the things that are hard and time consuming are exactly this, because I think in every single interview when mobile hacking is mentioned, and no matter if it's an interview from 5 years ago, 2 years ago, now, either you or somebody else would say that still there is not many people doing mobile hacking. Is it still true in 2024?
Oh yeah, absolutely. There are very few people. Like I am surprised to see not like I'm waiting to see like a slew of new mobile hackers come up, but it's still very, very niche. Very few people get into it. It's a super high barrier for entry for some reason, and it seems to be mostly existing hackers that already know like what they're doing, like saying, "Oh, I want to start doing mobile hacking as well." Not just people being like, "Oh, I like." Pulling apart mobile apps like I was when I was 16.
Yeah, you have a very, very unique path that you just started with the mobile hacking stuff, and this got you even more unique path with the live hacking event and stuff like this. But it's
exactly.
Fun.
Yeah, I think there's probably a decent amount of like uncovered untested attack surface on iOS stuff because of this barrier to entry. Like you said, because it's so hard and because there's this high bar to even get into it that automatically is going to stop so many people's eyes from looking at it. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's some, really cool iOS specific attacks and all sorts of things that just haven't been tested because it's, nobody's looking at it.
Yeah. And also one of the questions about mobile apps, do you have some sort of automation around them to, scan for vulnerabilities or scan for secrets or?
Yeah, a little bit. So I have some fancy grep or whatever you want to call it for looking through strings and stuff. I also have a couple little shortcuts, bash scripts and stuff that I use to basically just like look at the XML. One of them I think I actually have published on my GitHub for parsing the Android manifest XML. Okay. I'll try and find that and link that to you as well. But I usually run that and it just will print out all the schemas, all the activities, anything that's exported. There's another great tool called Medusa by Chopin with a 0. I'll send that one to you there. That one's also really a great tool for just sort of like getting attack surface and exploring the APK that utilizes Frida under the hood. That was written by another mobile hacker. I don't know if they want to be outed, so I won't say what their username is. But they're a great mobile hacker, and this tool is made by them, so they do a lot of really cool stuff. But it's definitely kind of tricky to do automation on the mobile level unless you get really in the weeds, because it's a lot of code analysis a lot of the time. So I do have some automation, mostly for finding attack surface and just like making things a little bit easier to know where to start looking. But then a lot of it is manual sort of tooling. A lot of it's just like aliases to other commands. Yeah.
Okay. Let's go to the next section, because apart from being a hacker, you're also now a program manager, which means you have the unique perspective of seeing both sides of Bug Bounty. And my first question is, when working with hunters, what are some, let's say, green flags that make you think, I'd like to keep this hunter hunting on my program because he finds some good stuff?
Yeah, so I think a lot of the time, sort of capturing the attention of a hacker can be really challenging. Part of it is having a scope that keeps them engaged, and part of it is also just having a team that appreciates them and keeps them engaged. So when they're putting in good, solid research, and what I mean by that is like it's not necessarily just like fluff, or it's not just like here's a bunch of findings. It's impactful findings, and it shows that there's like a really good thought process behind it. I think for me, especially as a hacker, I can tell pretty quickly when somebody's just like run some automation and they, have submitted this report 500 times before, and there's no real depth to it versus some sort of thing that sort of walks me through like, how they got here or, the things that they had to bypass or, certain maybe bespoke research that they did for that program. It's not always the case for sure where each program has something that would allow you to do that. But I think when you can sort of approach your bugs from the perspective of the security team and you can sort of justify the security impact and you can demonstrate, sort of like you want to be able to phrase things in a way that the security team understands it. So I think sort of targeting your audience is really important and understanding like the people who are looking at this are looking at it from what's the impact, what's the security impact state. And if you can show impact really well, instead of just saying, here's a bug, that also really goes a long way, I think. Those are probably the types of people I want who are, spending a lot of time, really high quality research. And, they understand sort of the perspective of both the hacker and the security team at the company.
What is then the opposite? What are things that hunters keep doing that for you as a company are not bringing you much value and instead maybe it wastes your time?
Sure. I think like one big thing that I see a lot is frequently asking for updates. Sometimes the program things may have slipped through, but generally speaking, the way that things work, I think a lot of hackers don't really have the understanding of like what goes on behind the scenes when their report comes in. So
can we maybe go through the whole life cycle of what happens with the report from the submission to the end of it?
Yeah, sure. So I'll speak about it from sort of like the side of like we use HackerOne triage. So that modifies the process a little bit, but basically a report comes in, we will often get a notification about it, and depending on what it is, we may or may not jump on it immediately if it's something that's like a P0. But most of the time, we let HackerOne triage test it, make sure it's valid, make sure it's in scope, make sure it's reproducible, rewrite it into a well-formatted report, and then it gets submitted to our team for review. And at that point, we decide if this is something that is in scope for us and is something that we're going to fix. It's not informative. It's not an internal dupe. It's not, anything else. And at that point, if it is, then we will triage it and we'll create a ticket internally with the engineering team to get that work fixed. Then it's basically sort of out of our hands in terms of like, we can push for it to get fixed. We can provide them support, but we can't fix it ourselves because that's not our job. And so it's really on the engineering team to prioritize it. They have SLAs, they have their own work going on and stuff. So, it basically is waiting for that to get fixed. And then once it does get fixed, we'll verify that it's been properly fixed, that there's no, bypasses or anything. We'll send it back to the researcher and it gets resolved. At some point between when it gets triaged and when it gets resolved, we aim to pay out the bounty as soon as possible. Generally, we can do that if we can fully identify the impact. Sometimes we can't right away. Sometimes we have some behavior and we're not really sure like what the full impact is, or if it's something that, could have a wider impact or affect more people or whatever. So we can't really identify, what payout we should be giving it at that time. And then once we find out more info, then we can say, okay, this is the actual severity. Maybe we'll adjust the severity after triage. And then we try to pay it out as soon as we can. That's generally the life cycle is, incoming report, validation, decide if it's something that we accept, send it to get fixed, wait for it to get fixed, verify it's fixed, close it.
So what do you think is reasonable time to wait for updates? Apart from it depends, which I know is the only true answer.
Yeah, it really does depend. But I think, probably like at least a month. I don't know. It depends on what stage it's in, right? So if it's after triage and, it seems to you, the researcher, that the impact is pretty straightforward, you can always ask like, hey team, I was just curious, if you pay on triage or if, you'd be willing to pay out the bounty on this before it gets resolved. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help clarify the impact or whatever. Like, just be calm and courteous about it. Sometimes they might not pay until resolution. I think most programs try and pay as soon as possible, but generally, if they haven't paid, it's like one of a few reasons would be my general guess is either they're in the process of filling their bounty budget, which probably happens more often than you might realize. So they're just like stuck with no money and they can't really pay anything yet until like finance like stops dragging their feet, or they haven't had a meeting to do the payouts yet. Because a lot of times the teams will do like scheduled meetings, like maybe once a week or once every 2 weeks, where they pay out a bunch of things at the same time and they can discuss all the reports, or maybe it slipped through the cracks or they don't know the impact yet. So sometimes stuff does slip through the cracks, right? And so that's why I wouldn't say like don't follow up at all. But I think if you're following up every 4 days or every like week, that is like, at a certain, especially if they paid it already, then like, I wouldn't even be following up. Like,
why would anyone
right.
bother?
Well, right. And so that's the thing is like a lot of the times even, there will be researchers who, something's been paid and it's triage and they're like, hey, any updates on this? And it's like, what more do you want? Like, it's just the reputation, I guess. But it can be very exhausting for the program, I think, to have to continually respond to that and just try and like reiterate the same points, like, when it's resolved. Because a lot of times, like I said, when engineering fixes it, the security team finds out that it's been fixed and then they go and verify it, and then it gets pushed back to the researcher as a resolution or potentially a retest, depending on the situation. And so I think most of the time it's not that it's the ball's been dropped, it's that there's nothing to update on, right? The team's still working on fixing it. They have other priorities, like whatever it is. And it just isn't done yet. And so all you're going to get back from the security team is, nope, we're still working on it. Like, we'll keep you posted when there's another update, right? Like, and that's, you can send that same message like 10 times, but it's not going to change, the outcome. So I think, following up over and over again can be destructive in the sense that it can leave sort of a negative or a bad taste in the mouth of the security team when you're working with that researcher. And then the next report comes in and they go, oh man, it's this researcher who pings us every week about, the status of this bug. And, that's not a great experience. So I think, just being respectful and trying to be aware of the communications back and forth. Like, just remember there's a real person on the other side of, there's a real human being who's at that security team, who's writing that message back to you back and forth. It's not a robot. So, just keep that in mind and, just communicate openly and transparently is always what I ask. Like, there's no such thing as a stupid question. So if you're like, hey, do you want me to stop pinging you? Like, I bet programs would love if you just ask that if you feel like you're doing too much, and they'll say like, yeah, we'll let you know when it's done. Like it's, those types of communications are great to see. So, yeah. Yeah.
And also the thing about pinging somebody after the payout is interesting. I would never think, now I think about it, maybe it changed my mindset when I was starting Bug Bounty. I had still the mindset of being I was a pen tester before, so I worked in the company, so I sort of cared more about the security posture of the whole company because I was also partially responsible for this. But in Bug Bounty, after some time, my mindset shifted to I'm here to let the company know about the bug, and that's the end of my responsibility. If they make the business decision, it is not a vulnerability. It is not my problem. My problem ends with letting them know it's there, and my concern is my payout, and that's pretty much the end of it. That's one thing I see, and the other also is just the metrics of a program. Like right now, I have a program that says on HackerOne it usually takes about 2 months to resolve the bug, and now we are talking. It's been about 2 months, more than 2 months. It's been triaged. And I still haven't pinged them because that's exactly what I signed up for. I signed up for waiting 2 months for the payout. So surely I would ask for it. If the metric would say like a week, 2 weeks, even a month, I would already ping them. But with 2 months, I'm like, that's what I was promised to wait for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think like those metrics, like they can also be a little tricky to read because sometimes, maybe there's a report that's been open for a long time and then it gets closed. Or, they're doing cleanup or whatever, that can skew metrics quite a bit because, say you have some 4-year-old report that gets closed, that should have been closed, years ago, and maybe it was fixed already and just never got closed or something. that can throw your metrics off significantly. So like you said, like asking the team and just being like, hey, it's been a couple months, just curious if there's any updates. And then after it gets paid out, I really see no need in, like you said, understanding where the responsibilities lie. It's the same thing for a security team, right? Like it's not the security team's job to go in and actually fix the code. It's their job to support the team who writes that code and tell them, hey, here's the vulnerability. Here's how you should go about fixing it. Like not on a code level, but on a technical level, here's what needs to change. And then letting the team engineer that and verifying that it's fixed, right? Like you don't want to be doing everybody's job. And there are certain role responsibilities for a reason. So,
yeah. What are some other things what are some things that surprised you after joining the other side that you would never sort of expect or imagine just as a bug bounty hunter?
It's interesting because I've been on the other side for so long now that it's hard to think about what it was like when I was just a bug bounty hunter. But I think a lot of it boils down to just like the expectations of getting stuff fixed like right away, right? So everybody thinks like, oh, this is a security bug. Like the engineering team is not doing anything else. Like when they find out that there's a security vulnerability, like I just reported this, like they're going to drop everything and fix it. And it's like, no, like that is in a perfect world. Yeah. But like I said, they have their other stuff going on. They have a queue of other engineering work that they were working on for other features or other parts of the product or other bugs, not necessarily security bugs, but just like functionality bugs and stuff like that they need to fix. And that stuff can have higher priorities. They can have their own deadlines, different projects and stuff going on. So it's a much more complicated landscape behind the scenes when you have multiple teams who are also operating independently and doing their own things. And then you sort of just throw like a vulnerability in there and somehow it has to get fixed. So, like I said, in a perfect world, yeah, it'd be great if when the security team pulled up and said, hey, here's a vulnerability. It's a medium, and they go, okay, it'll be fixed tomorrow. Yeah, maybe. But I think the real way that this works is that there's these things called, service level agreements, SLAs. And basically that just says we have this much time to fix this. I think there's SLAs on HackerOne as well. But, generally it gives them that buffer so that if you report a vulnerability, they have up to 2 weeks or up to however many days or hours or months or whatever to fix it. And if they fall out of that, then you can start to, from the security team or whatever, you can say, hey, you're past SLA. What's going on with this? This needs to be fixed. You can't ignore it for this long. But as the researcher, it's not your job to know what those SLAs are. And it's not your responsibility to, be pushing them from the outside to get it fixed quicker. It's your job to report the vulnerability and get the payout, and that's it, and find the next bug.
Yeah. If you were to create your own bug bounty platform, would it be very different from the ones that we have, like HackerOne, Backrub, and others?
That's a good question. I think generally it would be pretty similar. Like one thing, and I don't want to diminish away from the platforms too much here. Like I think the platforms, if you boil it down, are kind of like glorified inboxes, to be honest. I mean, that is what it is, right? Like, even like from the back end, like we refer to it as like the inbox, where, basically researchers just have a way to submit stuff to you. And then you can, it has a lot of feature specific functionality, like, severity adjustments and CVSS calculation and triage and all these aspects that I think if you were to build it yourself would be kind of difficult unless you had a really, really different process. And you see this with the large companies like Microsoft and stuff. They run their own platforms, but most companies, I think, just it's a convenience factor where having something built in that's designed for this, that's designed around this, that has functionality and stuff that's specific and bespoke for bug bounty and bug vulnerability research and all that kind of stuff just makes it a lot easier. And then having the payouts and stuff built in is obviously really, really helpful.
Yeah. But also the reason I'm asking this is I see you guys doing the critical thinking bug bounty podcast, and I see you do already a lot of things there. And I would not at all be surprised if in a few years you would become a really big company. And I would not be surprised at all to see, critical thinking bug bounty platform or whatever would it be called.
Yeah, we'll see. I don't want to, I don't want to spoil too much, but yeah, we'll see what happens. I think we're definitely trying to work to sort of expand the brand and just sort of figure out what sort of other stuff we can do with this audience and with this information that we have.
Yeah. What are some plans that you can disclose to us?
Sure. Yeah. So, like right now we're really leaning into our Discord. I think the community is really like the awesome part of the CTBB podcast, where, we have all these really talented hackers. They're constantly in the Discord, like talking about bugs, talking about, hey, I found this thing. Any idea on how I could exploit it or how I could escalate this further? Anybody have any experience with this thing? Has anybody ever reported this type of bug to this platform or to this program? Those types of conversations are really awesome, and it's great to see like so many bug bounty folk in one place discussing these things and sharing and helping each other. We have a whole channel for tools and everything. So I think the Discord is probably where we're doing a lot of leaning into. And then we just want to, keep publishing really awesome research. I think we want to make some custom tools and stuff for the critical thinker tier. The people who really help support the podcast, we try to give back the most. So we have a lot of different automations and tools and channels and scanners and automations and monitoring and all sorts of things that we set up both for our own use, and then we generally expand it to the critical thinkers and say, hey, here's something that we've been doing for a while. You get this for free as a benefit of, helping support the podcast. So I think that's probably where we're putting a lot of effort at the moment. And then we're working on some other things. I think merch is something that we'd like to do, but we don't want to do like this typical, like just, the brand or whatever, like maybe a couple of them, but we want to do some like more bespoke kind of custom stuff. So we're having some discussions about sort of, unique sort of things that we can create for the community and for people who appreciate the pod and want to support a little bit more. But I think, a lot of it is just, we're continuing to make content every week for, I don't know what it's been, like a year and a half now or 2 years almost. So we're just, trying to stay ahead of things and, keep the content coming out.
Yeah, I can only wish you all the best. I think the content you do is awesome. I think it's the best resource that you can think of. So I only look forward to whatever you do in the future. I'm definitely consuming the content or whatever it is. So I wish you all the best about this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, and thank you so much for the interview today. I know you were a little bit ill, but I still appreciate you joining me today. I think it's been great. I wouldn't say unless you told me that something was off. So I really, really appreciate it. And tell people where can they find you or find the podcast or whatever you want.
Yeah, sure. So like I said, the podcast you can find it at criticalthinkingpodcast.io or ctbb.show. Or anywhere where you get your podcasts. I think we're on every single streaming platform: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcast. Well, I don't know if Google Podcasts exists anymore, but
I think they shut it down.
Yeah, they just shut it down, right? But yeah, everywhere where you get your podcasts, you can find me. My personal socials, mostly it's just Twitter, twitter.com or X, I guess, x.com/0xteknogeek. That's with a K, TEKNOGEEK, and on Discord, I'm just Technogeek, same thing with a K. It's pretty much my username everywhere for the most part. And I just really appreciate you having me on and for the discussion. This was great. And good luck at your upcoming live hacking event. That sounds like it's going to be awesome, man.
Am I going to see you there?
Yeah, I'll be in Vegas.
Perfect. Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thanks so much for joining me, and see you then.
All right. See you then.
I feel like I could go on and on for hours with Joel and still learn new stuff every minute. But for today, that's it. So if you have learned something new, please like this video. And if you want to listen to another episode of the podcast, check out this one with Justin Gardner, the co-host of the Critical Thinking Bug Bounty podcast, along with Joel. For now, thank you for listening and goodbye.